Hello, Frizzle fandom! So, The Sword of Kaigen comes highly recommended. It is a fantasy booktube darling, aka lots of people here on booktube have reviewed it very highly. It also won Spiffbo a few years ago, which is the self-published fantasy blog-off. And I have some very mixed feelings about this book. I've got some really high praise and some very high condemnation. I really didn't like the beginning, I loved the middle, and then I didn't like the end. So we're going to be talking about all that. So starting at the beginning, why didn't I like it? The main reason is I didn't feel like there was anything for the characters to do. There wasn't a call to adventure for any of them, it was just showing me a day in the life of these characters. I think the strength of the very beginning of this book is in the world building. The Sword of Kaigen takes place in a modern world, but there is a little peninsula called the Sword of Kaigen where people have not yet adapted to that modern technology because of propaganda and brainwashing from the government, and they're in a society that resembles more feudal Japan. So the beginning of this book is a lot of setup around that. Hello, I would like to come in here and give a quick insert on the use of language in this book, specifically Japanese. Because I already recorded a section on this, but I feel like I didn't get my point across right, so let me retry that. As a topic, I love Asian languages. Filipino is my second language and I adore it. If you want me to talk your ear off for an hour, just ask me some questions about Filipino grammar structures. But even though I'm intrigued by foreign languages, even though it's definitely a fascinating topic, I don't love the execution of it in this book. And there are two parts to this. One is the input of Japanese or Japanese-inspired conlang. I'm not actually sure how accurate the Japanese is in this book. I'm assuming it is. The input of Japanese words in this book. Because there's a lot of it. There are lots of Japanese words woven in throughout this novel. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes I felt like it was really excessive, especially the personal address suffixes, like san or domo. It felt like every single time a person was addressed in this book, there would be some sort of suffix after their name. And in Japanese, those indicate different levels of respect, relationships, etc. But here's the thing, I don't speak Japanese. I do not understand the differences between all of these suffixes. I was hoping through reading this book, through context clues and just general osmosis of knowledge, that I could better understand these concepts. But even by the end, I didn't. The book didn't give me enough hand-holding, I guess, to help me understand. And so, from the beginning to the end of this book, those little Japanese words only gave clutter to my reading experience. If I already knew Japanese, I'm sure these would be very helpful and really enrich my reading experience. In fact, I have already recommended this book to my friend that speaks Japanese. But the average person who reads this book isn't going to be fluent in Japanese. Because, unfortunately, the average English speaker does not know Japanese. And I don't just want to be white girl complains about non-English language in her books. Because if this had been used more sparingly, like for example, if instead of having this wide range of name suffixes, the author had just chosen a few and then helped me understand through context clues, okay, this is the one for respect, this is the one for someone under you. And then I could have better grabbed onto those nuances and better understood people's relationships through it. But because it was so complicated, a little bit above my skill level, it just didn't work for me. Now let's talk about a different part of language that's in this book, which is there's a very clear distinction between the local dialect language that they're speaking here on the Sword of Kaigen, and the wider languages of the world that are more universal training educational languages. Because whenever someone is speaking in the local dialect, it's normal text, and whenever someone is speaking in the larger national, international languages, it's all in italics. And when this first started happening in the book, I was so intrigued and excited about it. Because I've lived in the Philippines where there is a similar thing going on, where the national language, Filipino Tagalog, is pretty much spoken everywhere, is what they teach school with, etc. But lots of the towns in the Philippines have their own unique dialect languages that people actually speak on the street with each other. And there is quite a distinction and cultural resonance about those moments of switching between these two different languages that are both from the Philippines. And I found by speaking not just in the national language, but in the local dialect, that is when we could really understand each other and have mutual respect going on. So this is a topic I am fascinated by. And when I saw this very distinct use of italics versus non-italics language in the novel, The Sword of Kaigen, I was very excited for where this was going because the author had given us this tool to distinguish between local dialect and national language. I assumed that this would become an important plot point of the cultural ramifications of this, of maybe there would be a scene where we knew that some people knew what was going on and some people didn't because of this language divide. And I was watching throughout the entire book like a hawk for this. And there wasn't any payoff. Yes, there were scenes where some people understood what was happening more than others, but also in those scenes, it was always translated for those people, or they were able to infer the meaning through context clues and the parts of the language that they did know. You could take out the language divide in this book and not lose any plot points. So it's another example of this book being so interested in language and committing to it so hard in a way that it makes the format of this book a little harder to read, like in all the inserted Japanese words or in the italics versus non-italics. It gives you a few more things to have to keep track of in your mind and makes it a little bit harder to parse. And if this had been counterbalanced with a pro of having awesome thematic exploration and plot points come from it, then I would have been excited about it. But because I feel like we never got that payoff that these interesting language quirks implied we might get, I'm just disappointed with it. And even though I do love language, the culture around it, and particularly Asian languages, I think this book would have been stronger if we had just taken all of those parts out or greatly lessened them. So that was a part of this book that really disappointed me in the end. If you're the kind of person who just gobbles up pages and pages about internal lore of the world, explanations of the history of a culture, little mysteries inside that, then you'll love this beginning. Me? I don't care. I can get on board with it if it's part of the story, I can theorize with the best, but it's not what engages me and keeps me in a story. So, I almost gave up with this book, but I remembered that this is a fantasy booktube darling. I remember all of the raving positive reviews I've heard about this book and decided to stick it out for a little bit. And that is when I really started loving this book. One of the main characters of this book is Mamoru, a teenage boy who is going on the journey of discovering that his society is a lie, that the government is a propaganda sham machine, which is contradictory to everything he's been taught his whole life, and he's searching for something to cling to and to really believe in. And once we hit that plot, once he made the decision to start investigating the claims of the government, once he made the decision to start befriending people who might know more, that is when I started loving his perspective and really enjoying this book and looking forward to how it would unfold. Now I had a character-driven story to root for. So at the very beginning, this felt like a 1-star book. I was ready to give up on it. And then we got in a little bit towards the meat of the book, and then it felt more like a 4-star book because I had this interesting character journey, I was enjoying it all. And then we hit the middle, and it became a 5-star book. Because eventually we hit not just a character interest in the story, but also an awesome plot. Because, surprise, a war hits. The Sword of Kaigen is attacked. And then everyone has to step up and defend the town from the invaders. And this is a climax of Mamoru's story and a turning point in Mizaki's story, which is his mother, the other point of view character in this book. Let's talk about Mamoru first. His whole journey in this first half of the book has been, what deserves my loyalty? Because he's starting to realize that the government, maybe not. But here, in the attack of his town, of his village, of his mountain, of his people, he finally makes the decision that what deserves his loyalty is those people, that it's okay to get out there and defend the village, defend the empire, because it's his duty to defend those people in it, and he believes in that. And that's really his coming of age here, is finding something greater than himself to fight in that isn't this lying government. And in the pursuit of this, he dies. And that just ripped my heart to shreds. I felt like screaming. It was such a well done scene, full of emotion, full of everything, because this is what he was fighting for. This is a cause that he was willing to give his life for, and he died heroically. It was a crying moment and a stand up and cheer moment all at once, and it was a wonderful cap on his plotline. But we're only halfway through the book, which means it's good that we have a second POV. Mizaki, at this point in the narrative, hasn't gotten that much to do. She's the mother in this story, and she's been watching her son grapple with this, and because she was once a boarding student overseas, she knows how much of a sham life on the Sword of Kaigen is. But once upon a time, she decided for the good of the community to marry into this magical, powerful family instead of pursuing her dream of both being independent and maybe marrying that foreigner she fell in love with at school. And with that decision, at the beginning of her journey, which we get in flashbacks, she also decided to put the warrior part of herself away. She's a big warrior at heart. She loves fighting. But she knew that she had to become a prim and proper housewife, so she did. But then people are attacking her mountain, her village, her family, her children, and she lets the warrior out. And this is a big turning point in her story because after this, she can't put the warrior back. People see her kill enemy soldiers. They know that she's not just this scared little housewife. And most dangerously is that after this, she doesn't really want to put it back either. She likes being a warrior. She likes this part of herself, and she decides to continue with this. And so look at all of that awesome development we get here in the middle. And this is the part of the story where I loved it the most because I was so invested in Mamoru's story, which wrapped up really nicely. I was also so invested at this point in Mizaki's story, which was just kind of getting its momentum going. But from here on out, my enjoyment of the book did go down. In the aftermath of the battle, Mizaki is crushed. She's lost her son. Her entire village has been pretty much leveled and so many people have died. It's real bad here. And one of the other people that is emotionally devastated by this is 𝐂𝐸, her husband. They've never had a good relationship. They've always been distant, never even reaching friends. They just kind of ignore each other as much as possible. So when he is emotionally shattered over this, he expresses this by being even more closed off, by going off in the middle of nowhere, which is hard because now he's the leader of the town and the town needs that leader. And this is the point where I stopped liking Mizaki so much because she was so angry at her husband. And in a lot of ways, rightfully so. From her perspective, he let his son go off into this battle and get killed, and then is doing nothing to help clean up the village afterwards, even though he should be taking the leadership position. But me, the reader, had enough perspective to go, you might have just lost your son, and that's real bad. He also just lost his son. Maybe give him a little bit of slack. And every time Mizaki was hating her husband more and more for his behavior, I was hating Mizaki a little bit because I couldn't agree with her rage here. But me hating her wasn't necessarily making my experience of the book worse. It was just making me crave more and more the father's perspective, 𝐂𝐸's perspective. I was hoping and craving so much that we would get to see it from his perspective because obviously Mizaki is getting more and more biased. Obviously this book can handle two perspectives at once. Can we please add in one for the one we lost? Because at this point in the story, 𝐂𝐸 is getting just as much character development as Mizaki is. He is going through his own transformation where he's realizing that he needs to be able to, instead of just distancing himself from his emotions, being able to embrace them and move through them and be a more interactive father. But we only get his perspective for a few pages, and the rest is just given to Mizaki. And I feel like that's another thing that soured me on this book, because for the second half, his character development is just as important, if not more so, to the larger plot of this book as Mizaki is. And yet, it doesn't get a spotlight. He just does an abrupt change in the background, where suddenly he's nicer, he's emoting, he's empathizing. What? And I grieved over the lack of this book taking by the reins the opportunity that it set up so well. And because at this point, and I don't know how many people would agree on this take, for the first half of the book, this was a coming-of-age tale. For the second half of the book, the main conflict is a romance. The main problem to be dealt with is the deteriorating relationship between Mizaki and 𝐂𝐸. It is a marriage in trouble story. Did it commit to telling us this romance story? No, it just kind of peppered it in there. The climax of this book is when Mizaki and 𝐂𝐸 get in a fight, where Mizaki is so fed up with his behavior that she challenges him to a duel, and they both physically and verbally work out some of their problems, wrapping up the book's largest unresolved conflict. I loved this fight scene. I thought it was very well done. This is the one time when we got 𝐂𝐸's perspective, and I only wanted more of that drama, more of that angst, to be actually giving that the spotlight, to be feeding into the emotions of these characters as they're going through great changes. They have been in a terrible marriage for about 15 years. And now finally, they're at a spot where they can work through things together, where they can fix things together. And then it just kind of happens. It's not given the time and energy and care that other conflicts in this book were given. It's like we're told that 𝐂𝐸 gets a redemption arc, but the only thing that makes a redemption story really engaging and palatable is if you're getting it a lot from the perspective of the person being redeemed, of the person changing their ways and becoming better. And we don't. And then, how does this book end? Does it end after wrapping up this conflict between Mizaki and 𝐂𝐸? No. This book ends with a weird plot being set up for, I assume, a spin-off book, which, according to my research, looks like it's actually never going to get written, of a crime boss from overseas sending assassins to kidnap powered children to build an army, etc. Like, it has very little to do with the rest of the book. And honestly, the last few sections of this book where that all happens, just like, cut it out because it does not add anything to this book. There's a little bit where Mizaki reunites with her lost love, but realizes that she doesn't need him anymore because she finally has a good relationship with her husband. But honestly, I don't think that was needed either. I think all of that is only overstaying the welcome of this book because all the conflicts have been wrapped up. And what I care most about is this relationship between the husband and wife, which doesn't really get that much development or spotlight or anything after this point. So by the end, I went back to feeling like 2 stars about this book, but I still had the memory of the 5-star midpoint. I mean, what the heck? The draw of this book is undoubtedly the emotional midpoint, where we have everything coming together, the character arcs, the plot of the war and the propaganda of the government coming to a head, the magic system being used to its full effect, etc. But I think the people that will want to read these very emotional character arcs, etc. aren't always the same people who want to read pages and pages of fictional history lessons, aren't always the people who want to tackle all of these Japanese words that they don't know. It's like appealing to the people reading books for emotional romances and redemption arcs and coming of ages, and appealing to the people who read books for the intellectual puzzles. And yes, there's a lot of overlap between those 2 groups, but I don't think this book really excels in the intellectual region as it does in the emotional region, leaving me wishing that it had just cut all that stuff out. This is one of those books where I imagine that it could have been much improved if it had gone through an editor who had given the harsh lesson that cut down the Japanese words by half, cut down the world building sections in the beginning and end by half, don't try to set up the spin-off book so thoroughly, focus more on the actual emotions of the characters and the plot of the war, etc. And then this book could have been 5 stars for me, I think. So I have a lot of mixed feelings about this book. I will add to all the other voices here by saying I highly recommend it. I think even though this book didn't always work for me, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be your new favorite book, because it really is that good. If you read this book, please let me know, what do you think about it? If you just want to leave me an emoji, leave me a sword emoji in honor of all the awesome samurai duels. Subscribe for more videos on Frizzle Fridays, and thank you for watching.